Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Labor opposes this bill for the reasons that were very ably set out by my colleague Darian Fenton in her speech earlier. And just to summarise the key reasons for that opposition, this bill addresses an issue that simply isn't before New Zealand as a threat at the moment. It is a waste of the time of the Parliament, and that is why people have legitimately asked during this debate already, why are we dealing with this issue in this Parliament now? It is difficult to escape the conclusion that it is because of the scandals that the National Party are facing and having to manage at the moment. What shall we do if we are faced with scandal? I know, says the manager of government business, we'll come up with targeting an unpopular group, we'll come up with some imaginary enemy, and we'll come up with legislation that makes us tough in dealing with them. Well, sir, I think we can do better than that. New Zealand is a better country than that. I thought we might have a better government than one that was simply going to channel John Howard at his worst. But at least when John Howard was dealing with this issue, he was dealing with a real issue. New Zealand simply doesn't face the threat that this bill would contend with. And if anybody needs proof of that, they just need to look at the regulatory impact statement that is supposedly advanced in justification for the legislation. First of all, it contains a number of very questionable assumptions. The assumptions that officials were working with, either because they were instructed to by ministers or otherwise, is that there would be 500 people involved in a mass arrival. Well, sir, let's just remember the geography here. The Minister himself, in his introductory speech, conceded that the recent cases involved some 10 people in Darwin who, by all learned accounts from people who've navigated from Australia to New Zealand, just had no chance of getting here, given the size of their craft and given the time of the year that they were planning to sail. Everybody agreed that it would be a suicide mission if they tried it, which is why they didn't, which is why we don't get arrivals of boat people in New Zealand. It's because we have a series of natural defences that just make it very difficult, if not impossible, for that sort of exercise to be contemplated in the way that the Australians have to face a threat in reality that we simply don't. And if we want to think about further questionable assumptions, there are all sorts of strange figures in the regulatory impact statement. There's an assumed 62% declined rate for those who would come. The assumption that the appeal and review process would be invoked by all unsuccessful asylum seekers, that it would be completed in around 18 months. But by then they would have been granted refugee or protected person status or become eligible for deportation. But what's even more disturbing about this regulatory impact statement is the appearance throughout of the sinister words in square brackets and bold, information withheld. Anywhere that the reader tries to get an idea of what the actual threat is, information withheld. Anywhere that the reader tries to gain some understanding of the real justification for this bill, square brackets, bold, information withheld in square brackets. So the other problem with this legislation is that the leader of the National Party himself recently admitted that it isn't necessary. In July 2011, he said that New Zealand was ready to deal with a boatload of asylum seekers should one make its way to our waters. That was in the Herald on July the 12th, 2011. So apart from the scandals that beset the National Party at the moment, we have to ask what's changed. He said, we've upgraded our operating manual in the way that we deal with a mass migration issue if it came to New Zealand, and we're confident that we understand our legal position. He said, I don't want to go into detail, but all I will say is we've got the capability and we've modelled that we understand what we need to do. And we haven't proposed major changes at this point because we don't think that's necessary, although we'd be in a position to do that if required. Sir, what also demonstrates the political opportunism at play here are the minutes of the Domestic Security Committee of Cabinet. The 16th of August 2010 was when the committee first looked at this issue, and then got a report back from officials on the 30th of September 2010. Well, presumably the Prime Minister in July 2011 was reporting back the fruits of that exercise. That is, no major change required, everything's okay as it is. And yet 18 months after that committee meeting, we see this legislation. This is the worst sort of legislation before the House, a waste of the Parliament's time and opportunism, trying to stoke up fears amongst the public that simply don't exist. Now, so why aren't we looking at a government doing something that would really make a difference on the people smuggling problem? Why not do what the Prime Minister said should be done when he was in Indonesia recently? Why is it that we have a leader who is a lion overseas and a lamb at home on these issues? He said we should work with our friends in the region to target the people smugglers themselves, the people who make enormous amounts of money offering and peddling false hope to people in desperate situations by cramming them into boats and then shipping them to Australia, which is where most of them end up. Those are the people who need to be targeted, and the way to target them is to negotiate with the Indonesians and with the Malaysians and with other governments in Southeast Asia, which is the transit route for most of the people who end up in Australia and who are targeted by a similar regime there to the one that this legislation would set up. Now, that wouldn't require a showy piece of legislation at an opportune time for the government. It wouldn't require Nathan Guy to go on checkpoint and sound tough on a problem that doesn't exist. It wouldn't allow for the sort of scaremongering against this group of people that we are seeing now. But it might actually make a real difference to the reality of the threat. Deal with the people smugglers, look to those who profit, cui bono, and deal with them. Deal with them properly. Ensure that there are reciprocal agreements in place as between New Zealand and Indonesia and Malaysia, so that there is an undertaking by the police forces of those countries and by the immigration agencies that those people smugglers, those who really stand to gain from the traffic in human misery, are targeted, are subject to proper punitive regimes, are hit in the pocket when they try to make massive profits from that traffic in human misery. But instead, what we see is a bill before the House that is offensive in many ways. First of all, rubbish, says David Bennett. Well, it has draconian penalties, including provision simply on the warrant of one district court judge for mass detention of human beings. It suspends the right to go to the ancient right that everybody has, to go to the High Court and ask the question, did the lower court get this issue right? You have to get one. Oh, it's not an ancient right according to that jurist on the other side who knows these things back to front. Well, I'm sorry, it is. It's a fundamental right for anybody. It's one of the things that makes our democracy great. The ability to go to the court at any time and ask whether or not the government or any agency of the government has got it right is suspended and only available by leave under this legislation. Well, sir, I'm ashamed of this bill. The Minister spoke of how good New Zealand's reputation is concerning bona fide refugees and migrants, and once I would have agreed with him until I recently had some personal contact with the system and saw how precarious their funding arrangements are in order to deal with people who come properly and lawfully to New Zealand. When I saw the refugee study grant cut by the national government, making it much harder for refugees, bona fide refugees in New Zealand, to complete a tertiary qualification and properly integrate into this country. So, one of the finest moments that I can recall, one of the proudest moments I can recall about being a New Zealander was when we stood up to xenophobia and we took those Tampa boys off the Australian system, and we saw those people become fine, upstanding members of the New Zealand community. That is New Zealand at its best, not taking this shabby leaf out of the Crosby-Textor manual. Sir, we can do better, and the government should be ashamed.
If the member is seeking a call, then she must do so, and I would refer her to Speaker's Ruling 25(2). I call the honourable member.
Sorry.